The blood had soaked through Grace Abbott's dress 3 hours before the cowboy found her lying face down in the desert scrub, her fingers still clutching the reins of her dead horse. Dylan Grant had been tracking a group of cattle rustlers when he spotted the buzzards circling, and what he discovered made his stomach turn. The young woman was barely breathing, her lips cracked and bleeding from the sun, and when he carefully rolled her onto her side, he saw the dark stain spreading across her back. Someone had shot her and left her to die in the New Mexico Badlands, and by the look of the congealed blood, it had happened at dawn. He knelt beside her, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady, beating against his fingertips like a promise she was not ready to give up. Dylan was 30 years old, had seen men die in a dozen different ways, but something about this woman stirred something protective in his chest that he had not felt in years. Her auburn hair was matted with dust and blood, but even in her current state, he could see she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with vanity, and everything to do with the fierce set of her jaw, the determined angle of her cheekbones. "I got you," he whispered, though she could not hear him. "I got you now." Dylan knew moving her was dangerous, but leaving her would be death. The nearest town was White Oaks, 15 miles southeast, and the only surgeon worth trusting was Doc Emerson, who had studied back east before the war drove him west. Dylan's horse, a sturdy buckskin named Ranger, stood nearby, ears pricked forward with concern. The cowboy worked quickly, fashioning a makeshift bandage from his spare shirt to slow the bleeding, though he could tell the bullet was still inside her. He could feel it when his fingers explored the wound as gently as possible, a hard knot of lead lodged somewhere near her spine. Moving it wrong could paralyze her or worse. He lifted Grace with extreme care, cradling her against his chest as he mounted Ranger. The horse sensed the urgency and stood perfectly still while Dylan arranged the unconscious woman across his lap, her head resting against his shoulder. Every muscle in his body tensed as he urged Ranger into the slowest, most careful walk he had ever demanded of the animal. Each step had to be measured, each movement calculated to avoid jostling the bullet that sat so close to her spine. The sun beat down mercilessly as they began the long journey to White Oaks. Dylan kept one arm wrapped firmly around Grace's waist, holding her steady, while his other hand managed the reins. He talked to her constantly, even though she could not hear him, because somehow it felt important to fill the silence with words. He told her about the ranch he worked on, about the dreams he had of owning his own spread someday, about the letter from his sister back in Kansas that he had not answered yet. He told her she was going to make it, that she was strong, that he could feel her fighting even in unconsciousness. 2 hours into the ride, Grace stirred. Her eyelids fluttered and a small moan escaped her lips. Dylan immediately pulled Ranger to a stop, his heart hammering. "Easy now," he said softly. "Do not move too much. You have been shot and the bullet is still in there. We are heading to a doctor." Her eyes opened fully then, green as spring grass, clouded with pain and confusion. She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. Dylan reached for his canteen and carefully tipped a few drops of water between her cracked lips. "Small sips," he instructed. "That is it." "Who?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Name's Dylan Grant. Found you in the desert. Can you tell me what happened?" Grace's eyes filled with tears, and Dylan felt something crack open in his chest at the sight. "3 men," she whispered, "attacked our wagon, my father. They killed my father." "I am sorry," Dylan said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I am so damn sorry. Why am I not dead?" The question was not morbid but genuinely confused, as if she could not understand why the men had left her alive. "You got lucky, I think." Maybe they thought you were already gone, or maybe something scared them off. Dylan adjusted his hold on her slightly. What is your name, Grace? Grace Abbott. Well, Grace Abbott, I am going to get you to White Oaks. There is a surgeon there, best one in the territory. But I need you to stay as still as possible. The bullet is lodged near your spine, and if it shifts wrong, it could cause permanent damage. Can you do that for me? She nodded, just the slightest movement of her chin, and Dylan saw the determination in her eyes. This was not a woman who gave up easily. He urged Ranger forward again, keeping the pace painstakingly slow. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, and Dylan was almost grateful for it. At least when she was unconscious, she was not feeling the full extent of the pain. The landscape around them was harsh and unforgiving, all red rock and scattered juniper trees. The year was 1881, and this part of New Mexico was still wild, still dangerous. White Oaks had sprung up a few years earlier during a gold rush, and while the easy gold was mostly gone, the town had held on, sustained by cattle ranching and the stubborn determination of people who had nowhere else to go. Dylan had been working at the Double R Ranch for 3 years, had made a decent life for himself, but lately he had been feeling restless, as if waiting for something to happen that would change everything. He had not expected that something to be a bleeding woman in the desert. "Tell me about yourself," Grace whispered during one of her conscious moments. Dylan glanced down, surprised to find her green eyes watching him. "Not much to tell," he said. "I am just a cowboy who is saving my life." There was a hint of humor in her voice despite the pain, and Dylan found himself almost smiling. "I suppose that is a fair point." He considered what to share. "I am from Kansas originally, came west after my parents died, been working ranches ever since." "You like it, the cowboy life?" "Most days. It is honest work, hard but honest." He paused. "What about you? What were you and your father doing out here?" Grace's expression darkened. "We were heading to White Oaks, actually. My father had a claim to a small ranch there. My mother died 2 years ago, and he thought a fresh start would do us good. Guess he was wrong." "I am sorry about your father," Dylan said again, wishing he had better words. "When you are healed up, I will help you figure out what to do with his claim. I promise you that." "You do not even know me." But there was something in her voice, a fragile hope that made Dylan's chest tighten. "I know enough," he said quietly. They rode in silence for a while after that. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Dylan knew they would not reach White Oaks before dark, but he pushed on anyway, guided by starlight and instinct. Grace's breathing had become more labored, and he could feel fever beginning to set in. Infection was a real danger, and every minute counted. It was well past midnight when they finally rode into White Oaks. The main street was deserted, but lights still burned in a few windows. Dylan headed straight for Doc Emerson's house, a modest wooden structure at the end of the street. He dismounted as carefully as he could, then lifted Grace down, cradling her against his chest. She was burning up now, her skin hot to the touch, and Dylan felt panic clawing at his throat. He kicked at the door with his boot, too desperate for politeness. "Doc Emerson, I need help." A moment later, the door swung open to reveal a graying man in his 50s, spectacles perched on his nose. Dr. Samuel Emerson took one look at Grace and immediately stepped aside. "Bring her in, quickly." Dylan carried her through to a back room that served as the doctor's surgery. The smell of carbolic acid and whiskey hung heavy in the air. Doc Emerson was already rolling up his sleeves, lighting more lamps to illuminate the space. "Put her on the table, face down. Gently now." The doctor's voice was calm and authoritative, the voice of a man who had seen everything and could be rattled by nothing. Dylan laid Grace down with infinite care, his hands reluctant to leave her. She was conscious again, her eyes wide with fear and pain. "I am right here," Dylan said, moving to where she could see him. He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. "Doc Emerson is the best. He is going to take care of you. Will you stay?" Her voice was small, vulnerable in a way that made Dylan want to punch something. "I am not going anywhere," he promised. Doc Emerson cut away the makeshift bandage and the back of Grace's dress, exposing the wound. Dylan heard his sharp intake of breath and felt his own stomach drop. "This is bad," the doctor said quietly. "The bullet is lodged right next to her spine. I am going to have to operate, and I will not lie to you. There is a significant risk of paralysis or death." "What are her chances if you do not operate?" Dylan asked, though he already knew the answer. "None. The wound is infected and the bullet needs to come out." Doc Emerson looked at Grace. "Young lady, I am going to give you something for the pain, but I need you to understand the risks. Do you consent to this surgery?" "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Do whatever you need to do." The doctor nodded and prepared a syringe of morphine. "This will help with the pain, though you may still feel some pressure. I need you to stay as still as humanly possible. Can you do that?" "Yes." Dylan watched as the doctor administered the morphine, saw Grace's features relax slightly as the drug took effect. Her eyes remained on Dylan's face, drawing strength from his presence. He reached out and took her hand, and her fingers immediately gripped his with surprising force. "Talk to me," she whispered. "Please, I need to hear your voice." So Dylan talked. He told her about the first time he rode a horse, how he had fallen off 7 times before he finally stayed on. He told her about the time he had to deliver a calf in the middle of a thunderstorm, how terrified he had been that he would lose both the calf and the mother, but how everything had turned out fine in the end. He told her about the constellation his mother had shown him when he was a boy, the one she said was watching over them always. Doc Emerson worked with steady, practiced hands. The surgery was delicate, requiring precision that could only come from years of experience. Dylan could not watch the actual procedure, could not bear to see Grace's blood and torn flesh, so he kept his eyes locked on her face, kept talking, kept holding her hand. She squeezed his fingers so hard he thought they might break, but he did not complain, did not pull away. "Almost there," Doc Emerson murmured. "Just a bit more." The surgery took nearly 2 hours. Dylan's throat was raw from talking by the time the doctor finally straightened up, holding a bloody bullet in his forceps. "Got it," he said, a note of triumph in his voice. "Now I just need to close her up and pray infection does not set in." "Will she walk?" Dylan asked, the question that had been haunting him since he found her. Too soon to tell. The bullet did not sever the spine, but there was pressure and trauma. "We will not know the full extent until she wakes up, and we can assess nerve function." Doc Emerson began stitching the wound closed with practiced efficiency. "You saved her life by getting her here when you did. A few more hours and she would have been beyond help." Dylan looked down at Grace. The morphine had finally pulled her under completely, her face peaceful in sleep. She looked younger like this, and Dylan realized she could not be more than 22 or 23. So young to have lost everything, so young to be fighting for her life. "I have a spare room," Doc Emerson said as he finished the final stitches and bandaged the wound. "She will need to stay here for at least a week, maybe longer. I will need to monitor her closely." "I will pay whatever it costs," Dylan said immediately. The doctor raised an eyebrow. "You related to this girl?" "No, sir, but I am not leaving her to face this alone." Doc Emerson studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You can sleep in the chair here if you like. Something tells me she will want to see a familiar face when she wakes up." Dylan did exactly that. He pulled a wooden chair close to the bed where they had moved Grace, and he sat down, his body aching with exhaustion but his mind refusing to rest. He watched the rise and fall of her breathing, listened to the soft sounds she made in morphine-induced sleep, and somewhere in those dark hours before dawn, Dylan Grant admitted to himself that something fundamental had shifted in his world. This woman, this stranger he had found bleeding in the desert, had become important to him in a way he could not fully explain. Grace woke 2 days later. Dylan was dozing in his chair, his head tilted back at an uncomfortable angle when he heard her voice. Dylan. His eyes flew open and he was on his feet in an instant. Grace was looking at him, fully conscious, her green eyes clear despite the obvious pain etched in her features. "Hey," he said softly, moving to her side. "Welcome back. How long?" "2 days since the surgery. Doc Emerson had to remove the bullet from near your spine. Do you remember?" She nodded slowly. "Some of it. I remember you talking to me. You told me about delivering a calf in a storm." Dylan felt his face heat. "Yeah, well, you asked me to talk. Thank you." Her voice was thick with emotion. "For everything, you saved my life. Doc Emerson did the hard part, but you found me. You rode with me for hours, keeping me alive. You stayed with me through the surgery." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "My father is really gone, is he not? It was not some fever dream." Dylan pulled the chair closer and sat down, taking her hand in his. "I am sorry, Grace. I rode back out yesterday morning to look for your wagon. I found your father and gave him a proper burial. I marked the spot so you can visit when you are healed." The tears spilled over then, tracking down her cheeks. Dylan did not try to stop them, did not offer useless platitudes. He just held her hand and let her grieve. "He was a good man," Grace said when she could speak again. "He just wanted a better life for us, and those men killed him for what? A wagon and some supplies. Evil does not always have a reason," Dylan said quietly. "But I promise you I will find them. I saw tracks near where I found you. Once you are better, I am going to hunt them down and make sure they face justice." Grace shook her head weakly. "That could get you killed. Maybe. But it is the right thing to do." They sat in silence for a moment before Grace asked the question that had clearly been weighing on her. "Can I move my legs?" Dylan felt his heart skip. "Doc says it is too early to tell. He wants to do some tests once you are stronger." "But Grace, even if I cannot walk, I will deal with it," she interrupted, her voice firm despite her weakness. "I am alive, and that is more than I had any right to expect. Whatever comes next, I will face it." Dylan found himself marveling at her strength. Most people would have broken under this much tragedy and uncertainty, but Grace Abbott seemed to have steel running through her spine, bullet wound or not. Doc Emerson came in a few minutes later, pleased to find his patient awake and alert. He conducted a series of tests, asking Grace to try moving her toes, to tell him when she could feel him touching different parts of her legs. Dylan watched with his heart in his throat as Grace concentrated, her face tightening with effort. "Good," Doc Emerson said after several minutes. "Very good. You have sensation and some movement. There is nerve damage, no question, but I do not think it is permanent. With time and physical therapy, I believe you will walk again." Grace closed her eyes, relief washing over her features. "Thank you, doctor." Over the next week, Dylan barely left Grace's side. He helped Doc Emerson change her bandages, brought her meals, read to her from the worn books on the doctor's shelves. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Grace told him about growing up in Missouri, about her mother's death from pneumonia, about the dreams she and her father had shared for their new life in New Mexico. Dylan shared more about his own past, about the loneliness of the cowboy life, about the sunrises he had seen over the open range that made him believe in something bigger than himself. "Why did you never marry?" Grace asked one afternoon. She was sitting up now, propped against pillows, looking stronger each day. Dylan considered the question. Never found the right woman, I guess. The life I lead, it is not easy for a wife. Long hours, little pay, always moving from ranch to ranch. But you want to settle down someday. Have your own place. That is the dream, he admitted. A piece of land I can call mine, some cattle, maybe horses. A house with a porch where I can sit and watch the sunset without having to worry about riding out again at dawn. Grace smiled. That sounds nice. What about you? Dylan asked. You ever been married? Engaged? No. There was a boy back in Missouri, but he made it clear he expected a wife who would be content staying home and never having an opinion about anything. I ended that quickly. Dylan laughed. I cannot imagine you ever being content to keep quiet. Is that a bad thing? She raised an eyebrow, challenging him. Not at all, Dylan said seriously. I like that you speak your mind. It is refreshing. Something passed between them then, a charge in the air that had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with attraction. Dylan felt it, knew Grace felt it too by the way her cheeks flushed. But he did not act on it. She was still healing, still vulnerable. Whatever this was between them, it deserved time to develop properly. By the second week, Grace was able to stand with assistance, taking tentative steps while Dylan supported her weight. The first time she walked from the bed to the chair, she cried with joy, and Dylan found his own eyes suspiciously wet. Her progress was remarkable, defying Doc Emerson's cautious predictions. You are a fighter, the doctor told her with genuine admiration. I have seen strong men give up with less injury than you suffered. You have something special in you, Miss Abbott. But progress brought new challenges. Grace had nowhere to go, no family left, and her father's claim to the ranch was tied up in paperwork that would take months to sort out. Dylan solved the problem the only way he could think of. He went to his boss at the Double R Ranch and explained the situation. I need to take some time, Dylan told Rusty Harrison, the grizzled ranch owner. There is a woman who needs help and I aim to provide it. Rusty studied him with shrewd eyes. This woman special to you? Yes, sir, Dylan admitted. She is. Then you go help her. Your job will be here when you get back. And Dylan, if you need anything, you let me know. I owe you for saving that herd during the flood last spring. With that settled, Dylan arranged for Grace to stay at the boarding house run by Mrs. Martha Cooper, a widow who had a kind heart and a spare room. He paid for 3 months up front and made it clear that Grace was under his protection. Word spread quickly through White Oaks, as it always did in small towns. Some people whispered about the impropriety of an unmarried man caring for an unmarried woman, but most folks were decent enough to see it for what it was. A good man helping someone in need. Grace continued her recovery at the boarding house, and Dylan visited her every day. He helped her with the exercises Doc Emerson had prescribed, walking with her up and down the street as she slowly regained her strength. They had dinner together most evenings, either at the boarding house or at the small restaurant in town. People began to accept them as a pair, greeting them together, including both of them in invitations. One evening in late September, nearly a month after he had found her in the desert, Dylan took Grace for a walk to the edge of town. The sunset was spectacular, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of crimson and gold. They stood together watching it, Grace leaning slightly on Dylan for support, though she no longer truly needed it. I have been thinking, Grace said quietly, about what comes next. Dylan felt his chest tighten. And what did you decide? My father's claim finally cleared. I own 40 acres about 10 miles from here. There is a small house, apparently, and a good well. The land is decent for cattle or horses. She paused. I am going to make it work. It is what my father would have wanted. That is a lot of work for one person, Dylan said carefully. I know, but I am not afraid of hard work. She turned to look at him, her green eyes searching his face. Dylan, I need to say something. I am listening. When you found me in that desert, I was ready to die. I had given up, but you did not give up on me. You risked everything to save a stranger, and then you stayed by my side through the worst of it. I do not know how to repay that kind of kindness. You do not owe me anything, Grace. Let me finish, she said firmly. These past weeks with you have been the happiest I have felt since before my mother died. I know it is probably too soon, that I should be mourning my father properly, but I cannot help how I feel. I am falling in love with you, Dylan Grant. Actually, I think I already have fallen, and I need to know if there is any chance you might feel the same way. Dylan stared at her, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break free from his chest. Grace, I have been in love with you since about the second day in Doc Emerson's office, when you told me you would deal with it even if you could not walk. But I did not want to rush you, did not want you to feel obligated because I helped you. I do not feel obligated, Grace said, stepping closer to him. I feel grateful, yes, but more than that, I feel alive when I am with you. You make me want to build something, to have a future instead of just surviving. Dylan reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. I love you, he said simply. I love your strength, your courage, your stubbornness. I love the way you refused to give up even when you had every reason to. I love everything about you. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a promise more than a demand. Grace kissed him back, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for a long moment the world consisted of nothing but the two of them and the vast New Mexico sky. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. So what do we do now? Grace asked. Well, Dylan said, I have some money saved up. Not much, but enough to buy some starter cattle and supplies. If you would be willing to take on a partner, I would like to help you build that ranch. A partner, Grace repeated, her eyes twinkling. Is that all you want to be? Dylan laughed. I would like to be your husband if you will have me. I know it is fast and people will talk, but I am tired of waiting for someday. I want to start building our life together now. Yes, Grace said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in White Oaks. Doc Emerson gave Grace away, and Rusty Harrison stood as Dylan's best man. Mrs. Cooper and half the town turned out for the ceremony, bringing food and gifts and good wishes. Grace wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Cooper had helped her make, and Dylan wore his best shirt and the new vest Rusty had gifted him. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Dylan kissed Grace with enough passion to make some of the older ladies fan themselves, and Grace laughed against his lips, happy and free. They moved out to Grace's claim the next day, and Dylan saw immediately that there was potential. The house was small but solid, built of adobe with a good roof. The land was rough but fertile, with plenty of grass for grazing and access to water from the well and a nearby creek. It would take years of hard work to turn it into a successful ranch, but Dylan and Grace were both young and strong and determined. Those first months were difficult. They worked from dawn to dusk, repairing the house, building fences, breaking horses that Dylan bought from a rancher in Lincoln. Grace proved to be a natural with horses, gentle but firm, and soon she was training them alongside Dylan. They bought a small herd of cattle with Dylan's savings, and slowly, painfully slowly, the ranch began to take shape. Winter came harsh that year, and there were nights when Dylan worried they would not make it. But Grace never complained, never suggested they give up. She kept the fire burning, kept their spirits up, and when spring finally arrived, they both felt they had earned their place on that land. The ranch grew steadily over the next few years. They named it the Double G for both their names, and it became known as a place where you could buy well-trained horses and good cattle. Dylan's reputation as an honest rancher spread, and Grace became known for her skills with difficult horses. People came from all over the territory to buy from them, but the best part of those years was not the success of the ranch. It was the life they built together. Dylan and Grace were partners in every sense of the word, working side by side during the day and falling into each other's arms at night. They laughed together, fought occasionally like any married couple, and loved each other with an intensity that never dimmed. 3 years after their wedding, Grace told Dylan she was pregnant. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing like a boy, and she scolded him for being reckless but kissed him anyway. Their son was born on a spring morning in 1884, with Doc Emerson attending and Dylan pacing outside until Grace called for him to come meet his child. They named him Thomas William Grant, after Dylan's father and Grace's. The boy had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and from the start, he seemed to have inherited both their stubborn determination. Holding his son for the first time, Dylan felt a completeness he had never known was possible. This was what he had been waiting for, what his life had been building toward. Grace proved to be as strong a mother as she was everything else. She nursed Thomas while keeping up with the ranch work, carrying him in a sling while she worked with the gentler horses. Dylan was a devoted father, taking his turn with nighttime feedings using bottles of expressed milk, changing diapers without complaint, and singing off-key lullabies that made Grace laugh. 2 years later, they had a daughter. Emily Grace Grant came into the world screaming her displeasure, and she maintained that fierce spirit throughout her childhood. She was all fire and determination, climbing everything, following her brother everywhere, demanding to help with the horses before she could properly walk. The Double G continued to prosper. By 1890, they employed 3 ranch hands and owned over 200 head of cattle and 30 horses. The small adobe house had been expanded with a proper kitchen and 2 additional bedrooms. They had become pillars of the White Oaks community, hosting barbecues for their neighbors, contributing to the church, and helping newcomers get established. But success did not change who they were at their core. Dylan still woke early to watch the sunrise, often with Grace beside him on their porch. They still worked side by side, still laughed at each other's jokes, still looked at each other with the same love that had begun in a doctor's surgery room all those years ago. One evening, when Thomas was 8 and Emily was 6, the family sat together on that porch watching the sunset. The children were playing some elaborate game that involved pretending to be wild horses, and Dylan had his arm around Grace's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "Do you ever think about that day?" Grace asked quietly. "When you found me?" "Sometimes," Dylan admitted. "I think about how close I came to riding a different direction, how easy it would have been to miss you entirely. We were lucky. We were blessed," Dylan corrected. "I was tracking cattle rustlers and found the love of my life instead. That is not luck. That is providence." Grace tilted her head up to look at him, and Dylan saw that her eyes were bright with emotion. "I never thanked you properly. For not just saving my life, but for giving me a life worth living, for loving me when I had nothing, for building this with me. Grace, you never had nothing. You had yourself, and that was everything." Dylan kissed her forehead softly. "You saved me just as much as I saved you. I was just drifting before, going through the motions. You gave me purpose, gave me a home, gave me a family." "Mama, Papa," Emily called out. "Look at me. I am a wild Mustang." They both turned to watch their daughter racing around the yard, her dark braids flying behind her, and Thomas chasing after her laughing. This was their life now, built from blood and pain and love and determination. The ranch that had started as a dying woman's inheritance had become a thriving home, proof that beauty could grow from tragedy, that love could heal the deepest wounds. Dylan thought about the bullet that had once lodged near Grace's spine, the one that Doc Emerson had pulled out and given to her as a strange keepsake. She kept it in a small box in their bedroom, not as a reminder of what she had lost, but as a symbol of what she had survived. That bullet should have killed her or paralyzed her, but instead it had led her to Dylan and Dylan to her, and together they had built something neither could have created alone. Years continued to pass, bringing their share of challenges and triumphs. There was the drought of 1893 that nearly broke them, when they had to sell half their herd just to keep the ranch afloat. There was the winter Thomas turned 13 and nearly died from pneumonia, when Grace and Dylan took turns sitting up with him for 3 weeks straight until the fever finally broke. There was the day Emily announced she was not going to marry any of the local boys because none of them were half as good as her father, which made Dylan tear up and Grace laugh until she cried. But there were also the good times. Thomas grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with a good head for business that helped expand the Double G even further. Emily turned out to have her mother's gift with horses, and eventually became sought after throughout New Mexico as a horse trainer. Both children grew up knowing they were loved fiercely by both parents, and that they came from a story of survival and hope. When Thomas was 20, he married a schoolteacher named Sarah, who had moved to White Oaks from Santa Fe. Dylan and Grace welcomed her into the family with open arms, delighted to see their son so happy. A year later, Emily fell in love with a rancher's son from a neighboring spread, a good man named Robert who treated her like she hung the moon. By the time Dylan and Grace reached their 50s, the Double G had become one of the most successful ranches in the territory. New Mexico had become a state in 1912, and with it came new opportunities and challenges. But through it all, Dylan and Grace remained constant, their love the foundation upon which everything else was built. They became grandparents 6 times over, and Dylan discovered that he loved being a grandfather even more than he had loved being a father. He taught his grandchildren to ride, told them stories about the old days, and spoiled them thoroughly. Grace was the same, always ready with cookies and hugs and wisdom. One summer evening in 1915, when they were both in their late 50s, Dylan and Grace sat together on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The ranch was quiet, the work day done, their grandchildren having gone home with their parents earlier. The sunset was particularly beautiful that night, the sky ablaze with color. "We did pretty good, did we not?" Grace said, her hand finding Dylan's as naturally as breathing. "We did better than good," Dylan replied. "We built something that will last long after we are gone. Our kids, our grandkids, they will carry on what we started." Grace nodded, then smiled. "Do you remember what you said to me? When you first found me in the desert, I said a lot of things that day. You said you had me. You said you had me now." Grace's eyes were soft with memory. "And you have had me every day since. You have held me up when I could not stand. You have believed in me when I doubted. You have loved me through everything. I just wanted you to know that I know that I appreciate it. That I love you more today than I did yesterday, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." Dylan felt his throat tighten with emotion. After all these years, Grace still had the power to undo him with her words. "I love you too, more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone. You are my heart, Grace Grant. You always have been." They sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a life of meaning and love. The double G stretched out around them, testament to their partnership, and in the distance, they could hear cattle lowing and horses nickering in the corral. The years continued to be kind to them. They grew old together gracefully, Dylan's hair going silver and Grace's auburn turning white. They slowed down, letting Thomas take over most of the ranch operations, but they never stopped working entirely. Dylan still checked on the horses every morning, and Grace still kept her kitchen garden, which had grown over the years to include herbs and vegetables that she shared with the whole community. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1921 with a huge party that seemed to include half of New Mexico. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, and people stood up to give speeches about how Dylan and Grace had helped them over the years, how their love story had inspired others, how the double G had become a symbol of what hard work and determination could achieve. Dylan stood up at the end of the night, Grace beside him, and looked out at all the faces of people they loved. 40 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his age, I found this woman in the desert, more dead than alive. I rode her as gently as I could to a surgeon, praying with every step that she would survive. I thought I was saving her life that day, but the truth is, she saved mine. She made me better than I was. She gave me purpose and love and a family. Everything good in my life came from the moment I decided to ride toward those buzzards instead of away from them. He turned to Grace, taking both her hands in his. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Abbott Grant. You are my partner, my love, my whole heart. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for being you. There was not a dry eye in the room as Dylan kissed his wife, and the party erupted into cheers and applause. They had a few more good years after that. Years of watching their grandchildren grow, of celebrating holidays together, of quiet evenings on the porch. Grace's health began to fail first, her body finally giving in to a lifetime of hard work and the old injuries from that terrible day in the desert. Dylan cared for her with the same gentleness he had shown when he rode her to the surgeon, helping her dress, bringing her meals, reading to her for hours. I am ready, Grace told him one spring morning in 1924. She was 74 now, her body worn out but her mind still sharp. I am not afraid, Dylan. I have had a wonderful life. You are not going anywhere, Dylan said fiercely, but they both knew it was not true. Listen to me, Grace said, reaching up to touch his face. When I go, I need you to promise me you will keep living. You will spend time with our children and grandchildren. You will watch the sunrises. You will remember that death is not the end of love. I will be waiting for you, but you take your time getting there. Dylan could not speak through his tears, so he just nodded and held her hand. Grace Abbott Grant died peacefully 3 days later, surrounded by her family, with Dylan holding her hand and whispering his love until her last breath. They buried her on the ranch, on a hill overlooking the land they had built together, under a sky as big and blue as the one that had watched over them all those years ago. Dylan mourned deeply, but he kept his promise. He did not let grief consume him. Instead, he poured his energy into his family, into the ranch, into living the life Grace would have wanted him to live. He told stories about her to anyone who would listen, keeping her memory alive. He made sure his grandchildren, and eventually his great-grandchildren, knew about the woman who had survived a bullet to the spine, who had built a ranch from nothing, who had loved with her whole heart. Dylan Grant lived another 6 years after Grace died, and in that time, he saw the double G continue to thrive, saw his family grow even larger, and found peace in knowing that what he and Grace had built would endure. When he died in his sleep in 1930 at the age of 79, his family knew he had gone to be with Grace, and they took comfort in that. They buried Dylan beside Grace on that hill, under two simple headstones that told a love story in the briefest of words. Dylan Grant, the stones read, and Grace Abbott Grant. Beloved husband and wife, parents and grandparents. Together they built something beautiful. The Double G Ranch continued for generations, run by Thomas and then his children and then their children. The story of how it began became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires. The tale of the cowboy who found a dying woman in the desert, who rode her gently to the surgeon, who stayed by her side and fell in love with her strength and courage. The story of the woman who refused to give up, who turned tragedy into triumph, who built a life and a legacy from nothing but determination and love. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sunset painted the New Mexico sky in shades of gold and crimson, people swore they could see two figures standing on that hill where Dylan and Grace were buried, holding hands and watching over the land they had loved. Whether it was imagination or something more, no one could say for certain. But it brought comfort to know that some love stories do not end with death, that some partnerships are so strong they transcend time itself. The Double G stood as proof that from the darkest moments can come the greatest joys, that one decision to ride toward danger instead of away from it can change everything, that love found in the most unlikely circumstances can be the truest love of all. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth. Dylan Grant had found Grace Abbott in the desert with a bullet lodged near her spine, and in saving her life, he had found his own.